I'm historian Tim Roberts, and welcome to Bad Hoss History. Today we are in Lincoln, New Mexico, taking a walk down what President Rutherford B. Hayes once called the most dangerous street in America. Henry McCarty, alias William H. Bonney, alias Billy the Kid, Sheriff Patrick F. Garrett, Susan McSween, Lawrence Murphy, John Tunstall, John Chisum, and Governor Lew Wallace are just a few of the notable and notorious characters from New Mexico's turbulent territorial period who once walked down this dusty street. The village of Lincoln might seem small, but the role that it played in New Mexico's history is significant. A walk through this town takes you back in time to a period when the New Mexico territory was as wild as any place in the West, when the line between outlaw and lawman was blurred, and when more disputes were settled with bullets than with ballots. So let's take a walk through history and learn a little bit more about Lincoln. Join us as we walk down the most dangerous street in America. One of the oldest buildings in Lincoln, the first two rooms of the Ellis Store were constructed sometime prior to 1861. After being expanded by Elisha Dow, it was purchased by Isaac Ellis in 1877 and was used thereafter as a boarding house, store, and ranch headquarters. A contingent of the Tunstall McSween faction occupied this building during the Five-Day Battle before being forced to flee by Sheriff George Pepin and his posse, but not before Isaac's son Ben Ellis was shot in the crossfire. In 1905, Dr. James W. Laws bought the property and further expanded the buildings in order to convert them into a sanitarium for patients suffering from tuberculosis. One of the buildings behind the main house near the river was originally a grist mill located lower on the Rio Bonito and was moved here by Dr. Laws and renovated to serve as housing for his nurses. The patients lived in cottages located around the property and away from the main building. The town of Lincoln, despite its designation as the county seat, did not have a formal jail for the first 2 decades of its existence. During that time, those requiring incarceration were either held in the home of the sheriff or constable or inside the Torion located in the middle of town. Finally, in 1877, the county allocated funding for a permanent jail. Builder George Pepin constructed the structure, which consisted of a large stone-lined pit covered by a small 2-room adobe shack. One room was reserved for the jailer on duty, and the other covered the pit, with a single wooden hatch leading into the dark hole down below. This crude prison held many notable Lincoln badmen, including Jesse Evans and many members of his gang. Billy the Kid also spent time in the carcel after being arrested for horse theft in the fall of 1877, and it was while imprisoned here that he most likely first met Englishman John Tunstall. The county abandoned the carcel after taking ownership of the old Murphy Dolan store, and the structure was sold in the 1880s. All that remains now of Lincoln's first jail is a shallow ditch marking where the original pit once set. Constructed sometime prior to 1868, the Isidro Patron family moved from Santa Fe to Lincoln in 1871 and purchased this property. The building nearest the street was operated as a store and a saloon, each having its own entrance from the street. In 1877, Isidro's son Juan B. Patron was elected to the territorial legislature, where he became the youngest Speaker of the House of Representatives in New Mexico territorial history. A leading citizen of the town, he supported the Tunstall McSween faction during the Lincoln County War and was himself wounded and permanently crippled as a result. Built prior to 1868, Jose Montano and his wife Josefa operated a store, saloon, and boarding house in this building for at least 30 years after the Civil War. They were supporters of the Tunstall McSween faction during the Lincoln County War, and partisans of the Tunstall McSween faction occupied this house during the Five-Day Battle in July of 1878, until they were intimidated into fleeing by military forces under the command of Colonel Nathan Dudley from Fort Stanton. It was from this property that Francisco Herrera shot and mortally wounded Dolan ally Charlie Crawford. Territorial Governor Lew Wallace stayed with the Montanos several nights in March of 1879 while he arranged his secret meeting with Billy the Kid. On July 19, 1878, Colonel Nathan Dudley marched into Lincoln with 24 soldiers from Fort Stanton and set up his camp and headquarters near this spot. He claimed that he only wanted to protect innocent civilians from the battle raging around them, but his actions forced only Tunstall McSween men to leave the town and gave the Murphy Dolan faction the upper hand. Dudley's actions contradicted the recently enacted Posse Comitatus Act and the specific orders from his commanding officer, Colonel Edward Hatch, to not interfere in any civilian matters. Later, this site was home to the Roswell Trading Company wool warehouse, known locally as the Galleria. Built sometime before 1869, the Luna Chavez House is a good example of early New Mexican territorial architecture. The Luna Chavez House was originally two separate homes that were joined by adding a central entrance room. Juan Jose and Isabella Lopez, whose daughter Josefa married Jose Montano, lived in this house. Juan Jose Lopez served on the 1878 grand jury that cleared Alexander McSween of larceny charges in connection with the estate of Emil Fritz. Residents of the other half of today's Luna House included Lincoln's own Romeo and Juliet, Florencio Chavez, a Tunstall McSween partisan, and his wife Theodora, whose father was Sheriff William Brady, a Murphy Dolan man. Originally constructed by the Lincoln County Heritage Trust in 1977, the Anderson Freeman Museum and Visitor Center is now owned and operated by the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs and is the primary visitor center for the larger Lincoln Historic Site. Inside, the Voices of Lincoln exhibit explores the history of Lincoln from prehistoric times until the end of the Lincoln County War. Visitors can also view the 20-minute film, Lincoln County, Land of Beauty, Land of Conflict, featuring historians Paul Hutton and Frederick Nolan. Built sometime before 1878, Justice of the Peace John B. Wilson used the front two rooms of this house as his office after being elected in 1875. In February of 1878, Wilson wrote out 18 arrest warrants for men who were in the posse that killed John Tunstall and gave them to Dick Brewer and the Regulators, deputizing them as special constables. During the 5-day battle in July of 1878, Wilson issued warrants for the arrest of Alexander McSween and others, leading to the bloody climax of the Lincoln County War, the burning of the McSween House, and the death of McSween and many of his allies. From about 1873 until 1878, John B. Wilson lived in a primitive jacal located at the back of this lot, near the slope of the mountains behind us. John Wilson was elected Justice of the Peace in Lincoln in 1875 and was sometimes referred to as Squire Wilson. On the morning of April 1st, 1878, Wilson was working in his garden and getting it ready to plant. At that time, Billy the Kid and the Regulators ambushed Sheriff William Brady from just east of the Tunstall Store, and a stray bullet hit Wilson right in the backside. The Wilson family moved to another house early the next year, partly as a result of that shooting. In March of 1879, Billy the Kid held his now famous secret meeting with Territorial Governor Lew Wallace inside Wilson's jacal located somewhere behind us. Built prior to 1868, this building is one of the oldest in Lincoln. During its life, it served as a store, a saloon, and a community center for the village in the years before the Lincoln County War. On December 20th, 1873, this building was the scene of one of the most horrific acts of violence ever perpetrated in Lincoln. Under the cover of night, the Harrell brothers and their allies surrounded this building, seeking revenge for the recent death of their brother Ben. A wedding dance was being held inside, and the men unleashed a hail of bullets into the structure, wounding one man and 2 women and killing 4 other men, including the father of the bride, Isidro Patron. From 1869 to 1881, the county paid $50 a year to rent this building for 2 weeks to use it as a courthouse for the spring and fall sessions of the district court. It was in this capacity as the courthouse that the Convento served as a location for Lincoln's first legal hanging. On December 10, 1875, William Wilson was hanged on gallows erected in front of this building. To the surprise of the crowd, Wilson was still barely alive after hanging for more than 10 minutes. The sheriff then had Wilson carried back to the gallows, where he was hanged for a second and final time. After county offices found a permanent home in the courthouse in January 1881, this building was sometimes used as a private schoolhouse, but remained in private ownership. Local parishioners purchased the building and property in 1885, and it became part of the San Juan Church complex and was used for various purposes, including as a priest's house until the 1930s. It was during this latter period that it acquired its present name of Convento, signifying in Spanish a church building used for religious purposes other than worship. The building was conveyed to the state of New Mexico in 1962, and extensive restoration efforts began in 1964. It is now open to the public as a museum. Late in the evening on February 18, 1879, 32-year-old Houston Chapman walked in the darkness of Lincoln's only street. Chapman was a lawyer from Las Vegas, New Mexico, who came to Lincoln to represent Susan McSween, whose husband Alex had just been murdered during the Lincoln County War. It was sometime after 10 p.m. when Chapman ran into a drunken group of revelers, young men who were associated with the faction that had killed Susan's husband. These included local badmen Jimmy Dolan, Jesse Evans, and Billy Campbell. Also in this group was Billy the Kid and his friend Tom Folliard. Billy Campbell, a hot-headed young cowhand and a known murderer, blocked Chapman's path, demanding to know who he was. After a brief, tense exchange, Campbell shot Chapman in the chest at point-blank range, so close in fact that Chapman's clothes caught fire as his body fell to the ground. Campbell led the rabble to another saloon, leaving the lawyer's body lying in the street, burning in the darkness. Built prior to 1868, these foundations are all that remain of Lincoln pioneer and politician Saturnino Baca's home. The front door of Baca's house faced a short lane on the east that ran north from the main road to the Rio Bonito. The back door, on the west, led directly into the Torion compound. Baca had served as a captain in the New Mexico Volunteers during the Civil War and was elected a territorial representative in 1868. During the January 1869 session of the territorial legislature, Baca introduced a bill creating Lincoln County out of the eastern half of Socorro County. One of his allies in this successful effort was the territorial representative from Mesilla and Doñana County, Thomas Catron. Baca and his family rented this house from 1875 when he was sheriff until just after the five-day battle in July of 1878. That fall, the owner of the property, Alexander McSween's widow, Susan, took possession and held it until 1913. Constructed between 1885 and 1887 on land purchased by Father John Marie Garnier, the San Juan Mission Church was the very first permanent house of worship in Lincoln. In hopes of convincing the Diocese of Santa Fe to supply a full-time priest to the Lincoln Parish, citizens constructed La Iglesia de San Juan, making the adobes for the walls on site and hauling vigas from the Capitan Mountains. While the building was under construction, services were held next door at the former Chapman Saloon. Citizens also raised enough money to purchase a massive 800-pound bronze bell from the Henry Stucksteed Foundry in St. Louis, Missouri. As the population of Lincoln dwindled, the handful of remaining parishioners decided to convey the property to the state of New Mexico in 1973. The Department of Cultural Affairs and New Mexico Historic Sites assumed responsibility for its maintenance and opened it to the public in 1984. However, it is still available for weddings and other appropriate activities. The earliest non-native settlers to homestead in this valley arrived in the early 1850s, shortly after New Mexico became a U.S. territory. One of the first structures they built was this Torion, or tower, which became the center point of the new village of La Placita del Rio Bonito, now known as Lincoln. The original structure included an 8-foot wall around the tower, and early settlers have left accounts of sleepless nights spent in the tower fending off raiding Apaches. The Torion not only provided sanctuary during Indian raids, but also protected villagers during the Harel War and provided members of the Murphy-Dolan gang a great vantage point from which to rain bullets down upon the McSween House during the 5-day battle of the Lincoln County War. As the frontier closed, the need for a Torion diminished, and by the turn of the 20th century, the structure lay in ruins. In 1934, the Chavez County Historical Society and the Works Progress Administration worked together to rebuild the Torion, marking the very first of many projects that have preserved the historic town of Lincoln for future generations. On the morning of April 1st, 1878, Sheriff William Brady and 4 of his deputies walked from the west end of Lincoln towards the courthouse or possibly to the east end of town to arrest Alexander McSween and John Chisum. Unknown to them, a group of McSween's friends, calling themselves the Regulators, had secretly stayed the night in John Tunstall Store. This group included Fred Waite, Frank McNabb, Big Jim French, and William Bonney, alias Billy the Kid. As Brady and his deputies passed the store, the Regulators unleashed a barrage of bullets from behind a low corral wall. Brady was cut down, falling on the street with upwards of 12 bullets riddling his body. Deputy George Hinman was also mortally wounded by a bullet to the neck. The remaining deputies scattered for cover and attempted to return fire. It is unclear whether the regulators planned this daylight assassination or if it was a crime of opportunity. Regardless, Brady and Hinman were dead. Likely looking to retrieve his confiscated Winchester rifle, Billy the Kid and Jim French left the safety of the corral wall and raced towards the body of William Brady. The scattered deputies opened fire, wounding either Billy or Jim. The record isn't clear on which man was shot, but the wounded man was hidden under the floorboards of the Tunstall store while the rest of the regulators mounted up and fled out of town. The first rooms of this home were built in 1881 by James J. Dolan as a law office for his friend John J. Cockrell. Cockrell was a law partner of Thomas Catron and William Thornton. In Lincoln, Cockrell worked on behalf of the Old Abe Mine in White Oaks and the Feliz Cattle Company, the core of which had once belonged to John Henry Tunstall and which later belonged to James J. Dolan, J.B. Matthews, and District Attorney William Reinerson. Alexander McSween intended to build a school and church on this land, but died before he could do so. John Penfield, the owner of the former Tunstall store next door, purchased the property in 1914 and lived here with his family until his death in 1938. This beautifully designed adobe house was built as a residence for the Dolan family by Eugene Dow and George W. Pepin between 1886 and 1887. Sadly, James Dolan's first wife, Caroline Fritz Dolan, died shortly after the family moved into the home. By the time of his death in 1898, James Dolan spent most of his time at his ranch home along the Penasco River. In the 1920s, this structure became a hotel called the Bonito Inn, where actor Douglas Fairbanks Sr. was once a guest, amusing the townsfolk by leaping over the white picket fence rather than using the front gate. Built in the summer of 1877 by young Englishmen John Henry Tunstall and his partners Alexander McSween and John Chisum, this building originally housed a store, Alexander McSween's law office, and the offices of the Bank of Lincoln, as well as living quarters for John Tunstall himself. The land on which it was built had been purchased from L.G. Murphy by Alexander McSween in February of 1877. After John Tunstall's murder, his friends used the corral wall located to the east end of the building to ambush and kill Sheriff William Brady and Deputy George Hinman. Though it played a central role in the starting of the Lincoln County War, it was largely unoccupied during the large 5-day battle in July of 1878. After Tunstall's death, the building passed through a series of owners that included Susan McSween, Joseph LaRue, James J. Dolan, and William Rosenthal and Company. Eventually, the Tunstall store was connected to another, previously separate building to the west, and a pitched roof was added that tied the buildings together. In 1901, the store was owned by the Roswell Trading Company and operated by their manager, John Penfield. Penfield bought out the previous owners in 1914, and he and the Penfield family carried on the business until 1957, when the property was conveyed to the state of New Mexico and turned into a public museum. On February 18, 1878, 24-year-old Englishman John Henry Tunstall was murdered along a dusty trail 10 miles south of Lincoln, New Mexico. His death ignited the most violent period of the Lincoln County War, and soon he would not be the only casualty of the feud. Tunstall's friends decided to bury him here, behind his namesake store, rather than in the town's Catholic cemetery. On February 21st, 3 days after his death, John Tunstall was laid to rest, with the intention that his family would eventually retrieve his body. To that end, local tradition maintains that Tunstall was buried in a lead-lined coffin to help preserve his body for future transport back to England. A few short months later, Regulator Frank McNabb joined Tunstall in the cemetery after being ambushed and gunned down by members of the Seven Rivers Warriors. Then, on July 19, 1878, the climactic 5-day battle in Lincoln came to a close when the forces loyal to James Dolan burned the house of Alexander McSween to the ground and left him and 3 others lying dead in the dust. McSween and his law clerk, Harvey Morris, were buried beside Tunstall and McNabb as well. By the 1920s, the crude headstones marking the graves in the cemetery were completely gone, as was the fence around the burials. Alexander McSween's widow noted in a letter that she could not remember exactly where the graves were. Similarly, members of John Tunstall's family attempted to locate his body in the 1920s but were unable to. The crosses and plaques that now mark the graves of John Tunstall and Alexander McSween were placed here by the old Lincoln County Memorial Commission after they completed the restoration of the Tunstall Store and opened it as a museum in 1957. The original two-room adobe on this site was built as the Placita Branch Store of L.G. Murphy & Company sometime around 1868. Murphy added some rooms over the next 9 years before selling the building and a large parcel of land to lawyer Alexander McSween in January of 1877. McSween had the building further enlarged and completely renovated it so that by 1878 it consisted of 12 rooms in the shape of an elongated U with the open end facing north towards the Rio Bonito. The building was almost completely built of adobe with a flat roof, the only exceptions being 2 wooden sheds at the ends of the arms of the U, which served as kitchens. The McSweens deeded the 5-room east wing to David and Elizabeth Shields, Mrs. McSween's brother-in-law and sister, in late 1877. The McSweens occupied the west wing, and the parlor in the middle was shared between the two families. This house was destroyed by fire on the last day of the 5-day battle, July 19, 1878, and Alexander McSween and several other men were shot dead by members of the Murphy-Dolan faction as they attempted to escape the flames towards the Rio Bonito. Built about 1886, the original 2 rooms of this adobe building were built over the western edge of the west wing of the destroyed McSween House and may have been built in part with adobes from that burnt building. By October of 1888, these 2 rooms housed Madison and Orella Gorton's butcher shop. They purchased the property from James Dolan in 1888, but sold the property to William Rosenthal and Company in March of 1892 and moved to Downey, California. Over the next 20 years, a series of attorneys, including George Barber, Susan McSween's second husband, rented or owned the property and used it primarily as office space. A 3rd adobe room was added to the east side of the building in the 1890s, and a wood frame 2-room addition was added on the west side about 1900. Beginning in 1908, Isidro Fresquez acquired an interest in the property. He consolidated his interest into full ownership by 1912, and he or members of his family lived in this house until 1961 when it was conveyed to the state of New Mexico. This home, known as the Watson House, was built sometime between 1878 and 1886. William Rosenthal and Company acquired the building about 1888 for use as a residence for their employee Charles Beljean and his wife. Beljean was a native of Switzerland who managed the former Tunstall Store for the firm. Several rooms were added to the Watson House between 1888 and 1903, when Dr. Thomas Watson, a native of Nova Scotia, and his wife Virginia purchased the property. They lived in the east rooms of the building and installed a drugstore in the west room. The Watsons moved to Carrizozo in 1914 and sold this house to Dr. John R. Neal and his wife Pearl in 1920. Dr. Watson's neighbor and friend, Dr. Earl Woods, kept the drugstore open for Dr. Neal and himself until 1922. This partial ruin is one of the oldest homes in Lincoln. Built sometime in the 1860s, this was originally the home of Lincoln pioneers Vicente and Maria Juana Garule. In 1862, their daughter married Stephen Stanley in Albuquerque, and the couple moved to Lincoln. The home was known as the Stanley home throughout the 1870s and early 1880s, until blacksmith, lawyer, and businessman John Thornton purchased the home in 1886. Thornton was a member of the Lincoln Builders Association and partnered with George Curry to build and operate the Bank Exchange Saloon. Thornton and his wife Nellie were close friends of James Dolan and his brother-in-law Emil Fritz. When 2 Thornton children died in 1892, they were buried in the Fritz family cemetery east of town. In 1899, Thornton sold the home to merchant Jacobo Aragon and moved to Roswell, where he died in 1919. Jacobo lived in the home until 1913, when he and his brother relocated their mercantile store to Las Cruces. Manuel Aragon managed his family's ranching interests in Socorro County and ran a mercantile in Monticello, northwest of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. His brother Jacobo managed another family-owned store in Hillsboro, but sold the building in 1899 and moved to Lincoln, where he purchased a house and invested in another store. Manuel Aragon then sold his store in Monticello and moved to Lincoln as well, where he built this house in 1903 and worked with his brother at their joint store. Manuel and his family lived here until 1913, when the county seat moved to Carrizozo. Following this major shift in local politics, both brothers moved their families to Las Cruces and started a new mercantile business there. Built about 1886, this building was originally used as a furniture store, including the sale of caskets. From 1889 to 1891, it housed the newspaper office and printing press of the Lincoln Independent, owned and operated by editor James Kibby. From 1892 to 1894, Kibby operated the building as a boarding house. James Kibby's son, Guy Kibby, became a famous character actor who appeared in It's a Wonderful Life and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. From 1884 to 1920, it was used for a variety of purposes, most notably as a saddle shop. From 1920 to 1925, this building became Lincoln's first and only theater, and in 1926, Dr. Earl Woods and his wife, Mary June, converted the building first into a winery and later a soap factory. The first rooms of this building were constructed prior to 1868, possibly as a livery stable. The building was purchased by Frank and Annie Lesnet in 1887 when they moved from Ruidoso. Prior to moving to Lincoln, the Lesnets owned and operated the mill formerly owned by Will and Paul Dowland. The Lesnets added numerous rooms to the house and operated the boarding home where a young Lieutenant John J. Pershing, stationed at nearby Fort Stanton, was a frequent guest. Pershing later served as Supreme Commander of the American Expeditionary Forces in Europe during the First World War, and is one of only 6 men to be promoted to the rank of 5-star General of the Armies of the United States. The building is currently occupied by Bonito Valley Brewing Company and Bad Hoss History. The Woods House was built prior to 1886 by builder George Pepin, who hired a young George Curry, future governor of New Mexico, as a laborer. During its first decade, the building was operated as a hotel by Ben Ellis and others. In 1898, the building was described as the Mansion House of Dr. Skipworth, referring to Dr. Edwin H. and Willa Skipworth. Dr. Skipworth died in El Paso in 1908. The building was occupied by a series of lessees until 1925, when Dr. Earl Woods and his wife Mary June purchased the property. Until Dr. Woods' death in 1940, the home was used as both a home and his physician's office. The Woods maintained a vineyard on the property behind the building, as well as dozens of chicken coops. During Prohibition, Dr. Woods was accused of bootlegging, but was cleared of charges because he was able to argue that his wine was for medicinal purposes. After his death, the house was passed to his housekeeper and assistant, Mattie Wright, who maintained the home until 1976, when it was gifted to the Lincoln County Heritage Trust. This building, constructed in 1887, served as the headquarters of Lincoln's first development company, the Lincoln Builders Association. This corporation was founded by a large group of influential citizens in Lincoln, including James Dolan, future New Mexico Governor George Curry, lawyer John Thornton, former Sheriff James Brent, merchants Mickey Cronin, John Whalen, John Byers, and William Rosenthal, and County Clerk Jones Talafiero. The association brokered land deals and constructed homes throughout the region for about a decade before the death of James Dolan in 1898. The building was sold and has been a private residence ever since. The rear room of this building was originally constructed in 1887 for use as Lincoln's first schoolhouse. As class sizes increased, the school board added the front room in 1892. In 1926, the Board of Education constructed a new, larger schoolhouse on the property next to the courthouse and sold this building and grounds to a private nonprofit board of trustees to serve as a non-denominational church in Lincoln. This home was built in 1886 by Virginian James Brent, who served as a deputy for Sheriffs Pat Garrett and John Poe, and as Sheriff of Lincoln County himself between 1886 and 1888. His wife Carlotta was the daughter of Captain Saturnino Baca, sometimes referred to as the father of Lincoln County. The Brent House was occupied by numerous Lincoln residents over the years, but it was in a sad state of disrepair in 1958 before being acquired by the state of New Mexico and restored as a residence for Lincoln Historic Site staff. Now only ruins, the rear room of this building was built of stone and constructed sometime before 1878. During the early 1880s, this building housed the White Elephant Saloon, operated by Ben Ellis. Merchant John Whalen operated a store here from about 1885 until sometime in the late 1890s, during which time the Ozone stage from White Oaks to Lincoln used the building as its stop. From August 1901 until 1913, the Aragon brothers, Jacobo and Manuel, ran a feed store and general mercantile here. Between 1914 and 1927, the Lincoln Post Office was located in this building before being moved to the Penfield store down the road. Gradually enlarged with adobe, it served as a store, a livery stable, and by the 1930s as an automotive garage. Abandoned in the 1950s, it stood vacant until the early 1970s when the structure began to collapse. Construction of the Wartly Hotel and Restaurant began sometime between 1873 and 1874, possibly by L.G. Murphy and Company. When finished, the facility was managed by Sam Wartly, L.G. Murphy's cook. During the 5-day battle in July of 1878, the Wartly Hotel served as James Dolan's command post and as barracks for his men. On April 28, 1881, Deputy Bob Ollinger was eating dinner in the Wartly when he heard gunshots from across the street at the courthouse. Leaving his meal, Ollinger raced towards the courthouse and towards his death at the hands of Billy the Kid. Sheriff Pat Garrett briefly owned the building in 1881, and the building passed through many hands over the next few decades, during which time it was known as the Lincoln Hotel. The building tragically burned down in 1936, but was rebuilt by the old Lincoln County Memorial Commission in 1960. This building was constructed in 1887 by John Thornton and George Curry, members of the newly organized Lincoln Builders Association. Called the Bank Exchange Saloon, Thornton and Curry operated the business for 5 years before selling the building. Over the next few decades, the building continued to be used as a saloon, restaurant, and boarding house. Built sometime around 1886, this building was a private home during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Lincoln County native Roman Mays opened the La Paloma Bar in the building in the 1930s, eventually transitioning the business into a private museum as well. Prior to the Courthouse Museum opening in 1939, Mays was an unofficial caretaker of the building and would let tourists into the building with a key he kept at his bar and museum. The Mayses lived next door to the bar in a home built in the 1880s. The earliest known owner of this home was Rocco Emilio. Rocco lived here with his wife Rosa from at least 1885 to 1900. Rocco and Rosa Emilio immigrated to the United States from Italy in 1882. Mr. and Mrs. Mays lived here until their deaths in 1989. The cross that visitors see on the hill south of Lincoln was originally placed there by Roman Mays in the 1960s. Mays hauled the cross to the top of the hill on the back of a donkey and used electrical wiring and lights purchased at an auction at Walker Air Force Base in Roswell to illuminate the feature at night. Constructed in 1936, this building sits on the site of an earlier schoolhouse built in the 1920s, as well as the county gardens that sat adjacent to the courthouse between 1881 and 1913. These well-kept grounds contained a pond and numerous shade trees and were bounded on the south side by a small acequia or irrigation ditch. This impressive Pueblo Revival-style building was constructed by the Works Progress Administration and served the students of Lincoln until the 1960s. Built between 1873 and 1874 by L.G. Murphy and Company, this massive two-story adobe building served as the firm's headquarters and as a mercantile known locally as the House. The company went bankrupt in 1878, and ownership was passed to New Mexican lawyer, politician, and Santa Fe ringleader Thomas Catron. Catron sold the building to businessmen Will Dowland and John Delaney, who eventually sold the structure to the county of Lincoln in December of 1880. As the first permanent courthouse in Lincoln, the building became the center of both political and business affairs in the county up until 1913. Over its long history, it has contained a Masonic hall, billiard room, sheriff's office, living quarters, county offices, a saloon, and even a school. It was the scene of Billy the Kid's daring escape on April 28, 1881, when deputies Bob Ollinger and James W. Bell died at his hands. In 1938, the state of New Mexico purchased the abandoned structure and began an extensive stabilization and restoration project. The courthouse reopened as a museum in August of 1939 and has been operated as a museum ever since, currently under the direction of the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs. On the evening of Thursday, April 28, 1881, the most notorious outlaw in the United States sat shackled in the second story of this courthouse. Billy the Kid was scheduled to be executed in just a few weeks, and the chances of him gaining a pardon from Governor Lew Wallace was quickly evaporating. Sheriff Pat Garrett was away on an official business up in White Oaks, leaving only deputies Bob Ollinger and J.W. Bell to guard the Kid. Around 6 p.m., Ollinger escorted 5 other prisoners across the street to the Wartly Hotel for dinner. Alone with J.W. Bell, Billy convinced the deputy to take him downstairs and out back to the privy. While returning upstairs, Billy made his move, slipping one hand from his manacles and striking Bell over the head. Billy then grabbed the deputy's gun and shot him while he was trying to escape. From across the street, Bob Ollinger heard the gunshot and came racing towards the courthouse. As he approached the northeast corner of the building, Ollinger stopped in his tracks as he heard the voice of Billy the Kid calling to him from the window above. Before he could react, Billy unleashed a barrage of buckshot from Ollinger's own shotgun, killing the deputy instantly. Billy then demanded a miner's pick to free himself from his leg irons and, after almost an hour of working, collected a few pistols and rifles from the county armory, mounted a horse, and trotted west out of town into the setting sun. Constructed in the 1950s by the former Lincoln County Society of Art, History, and Archaeology, this outdoor amphitheater is home to the annual performance of the Last Escape of Billy the Kid pageant. The first performance of the outdoor play was held in 1940 as part of the quadricentennial celebration of the Coronado expedition in New Mexico. And the very first person to play Billy the Kid in this play was none other than renowned artist Peter Hurd. Held the first Friday, Saturday, Sunday in August, it is one of the country's few remaining genuine folk pageants staged and performed entirely by local volunteers. Thank you for taking a walk with us down the most dangerous street in America. If you like this video, subscribe to our channel below and let us know in the comments what you would like to see. And we'll see you down the trail and all the places where history happened.